The palace of Aurelius II stood like a crown of marble and gold upon the heart of the capital, a place where sunlight fell upon rooftops plated in bronze and gates carved with lions that seemed ready to leap alive. Travelers spoke of it long before they reached the city, as if the mere outline of its towers against the horizon could intoxicate the imagination. Merchants swore its windows shone brighter than the morning star. Children pressed against its outer walls, hoping to glimpse the silken robes of senators or hear the clatter of sandals as generals strode in for council. It was said the palace embodied the soul of the empire, orderly, rich, invincible. Yet inside, within its endless corridors and echoing halls, a darkness began to stir, one born not of shadow but of desire, madness, and the unchecked hunger of a young ruler who believed himself eternal. Aurelius II had not been raised for the crown. His elder brother had been groomed for statesmanship, instructed in the arts of diplomacy, law, and warcraft, while Aurelius, the second son, was left to tutors who indulged his whims. He learned music more eagerly than military maps, poetry more than politics, and the intoxicating rhythms of theater more than the dry rhythms of governance. Yet fate, cruel in its irony, struck his brother down with fever just months before the coronation. The empire mourned a promising heir and looked with cautious hope upon the boy who remained. At 23, Aurelius was tall, striking, with black curls that framed a face more suited to statues of Apollo than the portraits of stern emperors in marble halls. His eyes held both charm and cruelty, the kind that could persuade and terrify in a single glance. The people, dazzled by his beauty and youth, celebrated him with parades of olive branches, chanting his name as if he were chosen by the gods themselves. In those first weeks, hope thrived. He promised to lower taxes, to repair aqueducts that had begun to crumble, to grant bread to the poor in times of famine. His speeches in the forum rang like poetry, full of lofty metaphors and golden dreams. Senators, though wary of his untested nature, applauded with forced smiles, praying his reign would mature into wisdom. But beneath the shining words, Aurelius's heart beat to a different rhythm. To him, the throne was not a burden to carry nor a legacy to preserve, it was a stage. And what use was a stage if not to perform the greatest spectacle of life, pleasure without end? The transformation began quietly. At first, Aurelius extended his private banquets later into the night. What had been an evening of dining with friends turned into sunrise feasts, with musicians summoned to play until their fingers blistered and dancers collapsing from exhaustion while the emperor demanded encore after encore. When some of his advisors suggested he rest, he waved them off with a careless laugh. Why sleep when the night is more beautiful awake? The stars are not wasted in slumber, and neither shall I be. Servants whispered of the endless goblets of wine, the tables so laden with roasted pheasants, spiced lamb, and honeyed figs that marble cracked beneath the weight. Nobles who longed for his favor competed in extravagance, bringing gifts of jeweled goblets, rare spices from the East, and entertainers whose skills bordered on the indecent. Soon, these gatherings became less about friendship and more about indulgence. The laughter grew louder, the music wilder, the silks brighter. Aurelius's taste for spectacle deepened. He ordered his throne room draped with crimson velvet, his ceilings painted with scenes of gods feasting with mortals. He declared that his palace should never echo with silence, for silence was the companion of death, and he wished only for the company of life's delights. At first, the people marveled. The stories carried into the streets painted their emperor as a patron of the arts, a man who celebrated beauty and joy rather than the grim austerity of rulers past. But as the weeks turned to months, the rumors darkened. One senator, old Cassian, confided to his son in whispers, "The boy does not see the crown as a weight but as a toy. And toys, when played too roughly, break." He was not wrong. Aurelius's desire for pleasure grew into hunger, and hunger into obsession. The palace that once resonated with the dignity of governance now pulsed like a living heart of revelry. At dusk, when other rulers would have gathered generals to discuss borders or famine relief, Aurelius opened the gates not to officials but to musicians, poets, dancers, and those whose beauty made them ornaments of the night. He reveled in excess, commanding the kitchens to slaughter entire herds for feasts, the vintners to empty their cellars for his goblets, and the treasurers to shower gold coins upon performers until the marble floors glittered like sunlight on the sea. Yet even as he drowned in abundance, a strange fire flickered in his eyes, a defiance, as though he were not merely indulging but daring the world itself to judge him. He once stood at the balcony before a crowd, wine dripping down his chin, and declared, "If the gods envy us, let them strike me down. Until then, I am immortal in pleasure." The crowd cheered, though uneasily, for they knew blasphemy when they heard it. Still, none dared defy him. Who would silence a ruler adored by fortune and feared by his guards? Within the palace walls, however, fear grew. Servants whispered of nobles too ashamed to attend but too frightened to refuse. Some claimed to have seen Aurelius pacing the halls in the dead of night, crown crooked upon his head, muttering to the statues as though they were guests at his endless banquet. Others spoke of punishments for those who displeased him, banishments, confiscations, or worse, quiet disappearances that left families mourning in silence. And yet, despite the unease, many continued to flock to his side. Power and wealth have always drawn men like moths to a flame, even if that flame burns. Daughters of senators dressed in shimmering silks, eager to be noticed by the emperor's gaze. Poets composed verses dripping with flattery, hoping their words would earn them a patron's purse. Generals, though disgusted, forced smiles, knowing a single frown could cost them their command. The palace, once a temple of law and empire, now throbbed with the rhythm of music and laughter until dawn. Its walls, high and proud, seemed less like fortifications and more like curtains hiding a grand performance. Even the marble statues of past emperors, grim and austere, looked down in silent judgment as their descendant transformed their legacy into spectacle. But there was one moment, one night, that set the tone for all the rest. It was the Feast of the Harvest, a festival meant to honor the gods for the year's bounty. Traditionally, the emperor would lead a procession to the temples, offering sacrifices and prayers. Aurelius, however, declared he would host the festival within the palace itself. Citizens gathered outside expecting solemn rituals, but instead they heard music, wild and frenzied, spilling from the gates. The smell of roasted meats and spiced wine wafted through the air, while laughter echoed like thunder. When at last Aurelius appeared, he was not in ceremonial robes but in robes of scarlet silk, barefoot, crowned with a wreath of roses instead of laurel. He raised his goblet and shouted, "The gods have no need of offerings. We are the offerings. Tonight we sacrifice boredom upon the altar of joy." The crowd gasped. Some cheered, others crossed themselves in fear. That night, the palace became the empire's forbidden heart. And Aurelius, once the promise of golden days, began his descent into legend, not as the ruler of an empire, but as the emperor who turned his palace into a realm where pleasure was law, and where the line between celebration and corruption dissolved with every goblet of wine. The dawn that followed revealed more than just the aftermath of feasting. It revealed a ruler intoxicated by his own power, convinced that life itself was his to devour. And though the empire still bowed before him, the first cracks had appeared, hairline fractures in marble walls, whispers in the Senate, and uneasy prayers murmured in the temples. For the people had begun to see not just their emperor, but the shadow of madness that followed him, creeping ever closer with each night of revelry. Night fell like a velvet curtain over the city, but inside the palace of Aurelius II, the darkness was never allowed to reign. Torches blazed against marble columns, casting golden light that danced across mosaics of gods and heroes. Servants hurried with trembling hands to keep the wine flowing, their trays heavy with goblets of silver, their eyes lowered so as not to meet the emperor's gaze. Musicians tuned their lyres and flutes, dancers stretched their limbs in corners, courtesans whispered to one another, waiting for the signal that the revels would begin. The palace, once a fortress of order and the seat of empire, had become a theater of desire where the curtain never fell. Every evening the gates opened not to diplomats or generals but to poets, artists, singers, and men and women whose beauty alone was their invitation. Guards lined the corridors, their armor gleaming, though their duty now was not to protect the state but to ensure the revels were undisturbed. The throne room itself had been transformed into a banquet hall. The great marble table, carved centuries before for solemn councils of war, was now covered in embroidered cloth, upon which lay roasted peacocks adorned with golden feathers, bowls of figs dripping with honey, platters of spiced lamb, and mountains of bread still steaming from the oven. Amphorae of wine stood in rows like soldiers, their clay stained crimson from the overflow. At the center of it all reclined Aurelius. He wore robes of silk so sheer they clung to his body like water, and his crown, once a symbol of state, tilted carelessly upon his dark curls. His eyes glowed with the fever of someone who no longer distinguished between reality and performance. He was the stage, the actor, and the playwright of this endless drama. When he laughed, the room erupted in applause. When he raised his hand, the music swelled. He had declared himself not merely ruler of the empire but the eternal flame of desire, and those who surrounded him fed that flame with their flattery, their bodies, their art, their very souls. The banquets had grown so elaborate that even foreign merchants whispered of them in distant markets. They spoke of silken draperies embroidered with gold thread, of fountains pouring not water but sweetened wine, of dancers painted in shimmering powders that caught the torchlight like living stars. They spoke of Aurelius's appetite, not only for food and drink but for spectacle, for experiences that pushed beyond decency into the realm of the divine and the forbidden. Yet beneath the music and laughter lay a quiet unease. For every guest who came willingly, others came out of fear. Senators brought their wives and daughters not because they wished to, but because refusal was dangerous. Generals sat at the feasts, staring grimly at their plates, praying not to be noticed. To cross the emperor meant exile, ruin, or worse. And Aurelius, for all his indulgence, still wielded power sharper than any sword. His smile could reward a man with lands and titles, his frown could strip him of everything. There were nights when the revelry crossed into grotesque parody. One evening, Aurelius commanded that all the marble statues of past emperors be veiled with cloth because, he said, their stern expressions spoiled the mood. Another time he ordered a senator to recite poetry while standing naked, claiming that words sounded truer without the armor of clothing. When the man stuttered, Aurelius laughed until tears rolled down his cheeks, then threw him a bag of gold as though humiliation were a favor. The room joined in the laughter, though behind the sound were clenched jaws and pale faces. The emperor's power made obedience a necessity, but fear did not silence whispers. Beyond the palace walls, citizens murmured about the growing debauchery. Some laughed, saying their ruler was merely eccentric. Others prayed in temples, begging the gods to turn his heart back to duty. Still others grew angry, asking why grain was growing scarce while the palace consumed food enough for an army each night. The empire's enemies stirred at the borders, but Aurelius no longer summoned his generals for counsel. He summoned them only to drink, to watch, to play their parts in his theater of desire. Inside the palace, Aurelius believed himself untouchable. One evening, as the moon rose red over the city, he stood before his guests, a goblet in his hand, and declared, "I am not mortal as you are. Pleasure has made me eternal. Let Rome fight its wars until its fields, I shall rule over eternity itself." The crowd roared with forced cheers, but among them sat men who exchanged dark glances. Generals whose soldiers had not been paid, senators whose authority was crumbling, priests who feared divine wrath. Each cheer masked a seed of resentment, and seeds, once sown, always find soil to grow. The palace became more than a place of indulgence, it became a symbol of corruption. The musicians played louder, the dancers moved with greater abandon, the tables groaned beneath more food than could ever be eaten, but all of it was hollow, a desperate attempt to drown out the truth that the empire outside the walls was beginning to crack. Farmers rioted in provinces where grain had been diverted to feed the palace. Soldiers grumbled in camps, their loyalty waning as months passed without pay. Allies questioned whether Rome still had a ruler or merely an actor drunk on wine and vanity. And yet Aurelius seemed blind to it all. He strutted through his halls with a grin, surrounded by those who told him only what he wished to hear. He adorned his body with perfumes from the east, wrapped himself in cloaks of purple and scarlet, and wore jewels on his fingers as though each stone were a conquered province. He ordered poets to compose verses praising his beauty and decreed that these verses be carved into marble, as though poetry could outlast marble's silence. He believed the gods themselves were watching and envied him. He boasted that no lightning bolt could strike him, no fate could bind him, for he had already tasted eternity in the form of endless desire. But others began to believe the gods were not envious, they were furious. Priests reported omens, flocks of birds scattering in unnatural silence, flames sputtering in temples, shadows that lingered too long at dusk. Rumors spread that if the emperor continued his path, divine punishment would fall not only upon him but upon the empire itself. Still, Aurelius laughed at these warnings. The gods, he scoffed one evening as he draped himself across his throne. If they hunger for worship, let them come to my feast. I will offer them wine finer than ambrosia and dancers more beautiful than their muses. Perhaps then they will learn how to live. The laughter of his guests echoed in agreement, but their eyes betrayed them. They feared not only the gods but the Senate, which had grown restless. Behind closed doors, old men spoke of their fathers who had bled on battlefields to build the empire. They muttered of duty, law, and honor, words that had no place in Aurelius's palace. The generals, too, whispered among themselves, remembering soldiers who waited for orders that never came. Each day the palace gates opened to indulgence, the patience of those outside thinned. And yet Aurelius continued, night after night, lost in his dream of immortality through excess. The palace groaned with the weight of his revels. Its floors were stained with spilled wine, its columns echoed with ceaseless music, its walls became prisons for those too frightened to leave and too afraid to stay away. The city beyond slept in darkness, but the palace glowed like a beacon, some said like a torch that would soon consume itself. The people began to call it not the emperor's palace but the House of Shadows. For though the torches blazed and the music roared, there was a darkness there deeper than night, a darkness born of unchecked hunger and the silence of those who dared not oppose him. They whispered that Aurelius was no longer emperor but prisoner of his own desires, that he wore not a crown but chains forged from wine, silk, and flattery. And as the empire